Good morning. I hope everyone can hear me okay. This is Gabrielle speaking. I want to welcome everybody to today's webinar, and I'm very glad you can join us today for our session with Brian O'Leary. I'm going to do a short introduction just to give a little bit of information for people who are maybe using or connecting to one of our webinars for the first time. I'll introduce Brian and also just give you some tips on how to manage any troubleshooting you might need during the webinar and so forth. So I'd like to welcome you all to the Leave Canada Books webinar on global ebook markets and pricing. As I mentioned before, I'm Gabrielle Echeverry, and I'm the Manager of Digital Publishing and International Markets here. And I'm going to be here throughout the session to help facilitate the webinar. Today's presentation should take about an hour, and we'll have close to half an hour at the end for questions. At the end of the webinar, we ask that you please fill out the online evaluation. You'll be sent a link. It's also available on the last page of this presentation. Your feedback is really important to us and also to the Canada Book Fund, and it helps sort of direct our programming in the future. Without further ado, I'm very pleased to present your host, Brian O'Leary, the Executive Director of the Book Industry Study Group. Many of you may already know his work already, but he's a frequent speaker at conferences, workshops, events, and panels, and he's a recognized expert in the publishing industry. He has been the Executive Director of the Book Industry Study Group since 2016 and is the founder and principal of Magellan Media Consulting, which works with magazine, book, and association publishers to improve how they create, manage, and distribute content. He researches and writes extensively about issues affecting the publishing industry, including research reports on the use of metadata in the book industry supply chain, territorial rights in the digital age, and best practices in digital exports. He has written several reports on digital publishing for Leave Canada Books, most recently the Digital Exports Revisited, which was in 2017, in which we hope you will take a look through if you haven't done so already. In 2019, Leave Canada Books will be producing a bilingual report on this topic of global ebook markets and pricing, which will be written by Mr. O'Leary. So also we encourage you to look for that when it's ready and use it as an additional reference to what you are going to be hearing about today. And so now I'll hand over the controls to Brian so that we can get started.
Okay, thank you, Gabrielle. It's really a pleasure to once again be working with Leave Canada Books, though I'm in a new capacity or newish capacity, working with the Book Industry Study Group. There's a tremendous amount of overlap between the work that we do for the United States and our interest in international global markets and trends in pricing. To get us started, I wanted to at least give you an overview of what the talk today will be. We're going to give you a mercifully brief overview of the methodology, just a single page, but I think it's important that you know how the data was put together and what sources are going to be most frequently cited. The bulk of the presentation provides profiles of both what we call significant ebook markets as well as the emerging ebook markets, and we'll explain that segmentation in a moment. We'll talk about pricing, particularly by region, not by country. So North America, the UK, and the balance of Europe as the primary focus. And then we have some thoughts on how to put the information that we put together today to good use. As Gabrielle mentioned, several folks, when they registered, submitted questions, and what we thought we would do is jumpstart the discussion toward the end by we picked, I think, 5 or 6 different questions to try and answer in a formal way, and then we'll spend plenty of time working with whatever thoughts come as a result of the content that we're going to share today. So that mercifully short methodology overview, we used a range of sources. You have to use a range of sources. There is no one source. In fact, in many ways, this might be one of the primary sources now, both the 2013 version or the 2014 version and the one that's coming out next year. The core statistics, many of which you'll see today, are collected from the CIA's World Factbook. It's a pretty consistent methodology, useful, covers every country in the world and many territories. Certainly all of the markets that are profiled, all of the 20 markets that are profiled today are carefully followed. The statistics that we picked were things like population, growth rates of the population, gross domestic product per capita, the literacy rate, and internet use. We then calculated a variety of other statistics. Those included things like literate population, which is population times the literacy rate, the share of the population that has ready access to the internet, and there are some surprises in there that you'll see as we go through. And then book sales per capita, which is calculated. Generally, book sales the numbers are from a variety of different sources that you see here. They're converted to Canadian dollars at prevailing rates. Often the prevailing the size of the market is expressed in local currency, so in pounds for the UK, etc. But we found a way we used the rates that were prevailing roughly in October of 2018 to create a relatively consistent look at the size of the market. So the market profiles themselves, we studied 20 countries, and we broke them into 4 buckets, maybe 4.5 buckets. The top or largest one is we call the mega markets, the largest book publishing markets in the world. These include the US, China, Germany, and the UK. And as you'll see when we go through, China has relatively low per capita sales, but simply on the volume of on the size of its population, becomes a mega market. Emerging markets include countries like Brazil, Russia, and India, the non-BRIC without China, as well as Poland, Slovenia, which has a very strong reading population, and the UAE. There are a number of markets that are typically smaller, but they're important to Canadian publishers, and they break down, this is the 4.5, into both English language and French language publications. So the English language, we looked at Australia, Italy, Japan, Netherlands, South Korea, and Spain. For French language, we looked at Austria, France, and parts of Italy, so you'll see Italy show up twice. And then there are a couple of other markets that are potentially important and interesting. These include Denmark and Sweden. So it's a broad and fairly robust list with a lot of countries of interest, and I think you'll enjoy the data we're going to share today. One of the things that I don't get to do very often is kind of to step back and talk about what we see in working with the data and close up. The first that you'll notice is that there's a tremendous variation in per capita book sales. There are very strong markets, particularly ones like Germany, where there's a strong book buying ethic, and there are relatively weak ones like India, where it's a combination of both a lack of purchase as well as a relatively low price point for products sold in that market. There's strong population growth, above 1% a year, in 3 specific markets that are of interest: the UAE, Australia, and Brazil. That's something that we don't go through the population growth statistics in today's report, but it will be in the final report. But there are also 5 countries where population is shrinking on a year-over-year basis, including the strong book-buying markets in Germany and Japan, as well as Russia, Poland, and Slovenia. So over time, it's important to keep an eye on that, because the growth of the population, the growth of the size of the market, might influence your interest in pursuing deals in those countries. The other thing I thought about, and this is true, 5 years ago, the literacy rates were relatively broad, but they've improved enough over the last, since we did the first version of this report, that they no longer provide as much insight, I think, as they once did. And in a future update, it may not be necessary to track it as closely. There's really good news in that, and I've heard this spoken about in other settings, in that the global marketplace is expanding in 2 different ways. One is obviously access to books, but the other is folks the market themselves of literate populations is growing rapidly outside of some of these core countries, as well as in some of the countries that we picked, like India. And there's an opportunity here to get in on the ground floor and meet the needs of increasingly literate populations. Finding out how to do that with respect to pricing and availability in those markets is part of what we'll talk about today. Just for perspective, we have for each of the 5 cohorts that I talked about in the introduction, both a summary slide like this one, and then more detailed slides with textual information. I'm probably not going to spend as much time on this on the individual numerical slides as I might. Gabrielle's indicated to me that this presentation will be made available to everybody who signed up for it. So me reading you numbers would not be fun. But there are a few things that are interesting about this. One is the U.S. market, as you can see, in Canadian dollars, the largest book market in the world, followed by China and then Germany. There's significant range in these mega markets, but you've got between $9 and $50 billion in sales on an annual basis. But you also see here the tremendous variation in the sales per capita. So the U.S. market and Germany very strong on a per capita basis, followed by the UK. China, though it's the second biggest overall market, is, on a per capita basis, something like 1/5 the size of the United States. So again, it influences how you think about both pricing and the deals that you strike in these countries. A little bit of background on each of the markets, so that at least to start the discussion and help inform some of the questions toward the end. Within the U.S. market, agency pricing, as probably anyone publishing in Canada knows, persists for the big five. It is pretty much taken root. That's part of the reason that ebook sales have also peaked or declined somewhat, in that the agency pricing has pushed up the average price of a digital book in the United States and tested the willingness of the consumer audience to pay what amount to something close to paperback prices for digital books. There are a lot of different estimates for what share of the market in the United States is sold online. But there's a consensus that somewhere between 55 and 60% of the market is online sales, and the dominant player there is obviously Amazon, but they're not the only one. The digital share of the market right now is estimated at 15 to 20% on revenue. Could be higher, and I'll just jump down a moment. The self-published sales are actually thought to be increasing and could represent a much higher share of digital in the U.S. market. Not just in the United States, but audio is increasing very strongly in the market and has seen growth rates of 25 to 35% year over year for the last several years. And then on the library side, Overdrive is the dominant player. Biblioteca, a more recent entrance in supporting digital content sales to libraries. Now, China, as you saw, is the second largest market in total sales, and it's the largest market in the world for unit sales. There's been some movement over the last several years toward copyright protection, but there's also legitimately some continued skepticism about how robust those reforms are. The general reports there are that the online sales accounts for about 45% of the market, so lower than the United States, but still a pretty strong component. Happily, about 58% of the population is said to read books regularly. And there are a set of distributors that are largest, including Dangdang, Amazon, China and its China division, and JD.com. But it's also a fairly fragmented market, and the importance of local partnerships is generally considered to be very high. In Germany, it's got relatively stable sales, but recent reports point out that there are fewer book buyers, and it's actually a real concern within the German market. One of the questions we had in preparation is there more information available at the German market? And we'll dive into that in a little bit of detail in the questions. After several years of growth in the German market, ebooks are still only about 5% of total sales, and prices actually dropped in 2017 within the German market. You probably recall that in terms of per capita sales, Germany is the most robust market in the world. The average book consumer buys 8 books a year. And here, because of fixed price, or at least a commitment to fixed price, you'll see in continental Europe, throughout the EU, other than the UK, that physical bookstores retain a fairly robust share. If you look at the combination of physical and institutional, that's actually that's 2/3 of the marketplace, and online sales are only about 19%. There's been some growth in translation rights sales, but that's out of Germany to other markets. But it also might be a sign of increasing activity in terms of bringing books into the German market. Within the UK, book sales actually had a pretty robust year in 2017. Hardcovers sales were up about 31%. Some of that's driven by popular titles. Exports increased by about 8%, and sales to Europe increased 13%, and East Asia and Southeast Asia about 8%. But digital book sales dropped to about 2%, and now represent just under 10% of the overall market. And akin to the U.S., the audiobook sales in the UK have been growing significantly. They're up 25%, and now represent about £31 million in annual sales in the UK market. Our second cohort were emerging markets. So here you see on the left, Brazil, Russia, India. Those are the go-to for most people's definitions for emerging. But we've also added Poland, Slovenia, and the UAE. Population here ranges from a high in India of as much as 1.3 billion to a low in Slovenia of just 2 million. And as you recall, that was also a market where population is shrinking. But It's also a market where per capita book sales for an emerging market are relatively high at $51. You can see in Brazil, Russia, and India, which are those more traditional emerging market countries, the sales per capita are between 4 and just under 13 Canadian dollars a year, whereas Poland, Slovenia, and particularly UAE are spending quite a bit of money on a per capita basis. Not as high as the more established mega markets, with the exception of China, but still more robust than Brazil, Russia, or India. It's also a relatively wide range for internet access. When you're thinking about digital commerce, access to the internet is at least a proxy for the ability to support mobile infrastructure. And you can see that, in places like the United Arab Emirates, as well as Poland, Slovenia, and Russia, it's between 75 and 88%. In India, it's just 29%. That has been moving up relatively quickly over the last several years, and no one's going to ignore India, but there are infrastructure issues within the country that have yet to be solved. So you have 2 pages here on emerging market trends as well in these 6 markets. Brazil, is, you probably would imagine, is the largest book market in South America, and that's one of those markets where internet penetration has increased significantly since the first report was done in 2013, or the data was collected in 2013. Metabooks Brazil is hosting metadata for plurality of titles for the first time. That's a new development in the last 2-3 years. They're trying to create a robust market for metadata. And that's important for Canadian publishers because metadata is, particularly in international markets, a key way for books to get discovered. So the ability to have a platform that hosts titles and people can refer to is important for both discovery and purchase. PRH has made a purchase in this area, and 2 of the larger retailers are under significant financial pressure. That might reflect the internet penetration increasing, might reflect a greater interest in, or drive a greater interest in using online sales. But as is the case in the United States, bricks and mortar, they have to be very good, or they're not going to succeed. In Russia, it's been a story of turbulence, as it says here. Title production since 2011, which dates back to before the first study, has fallen by about 40%, and that's in the Russian language market. The book prices have generally increased over that period of time, although not uniformly so. And overall and per capita book sales are down since the first report was issued. One of the major trends is a decline in the demand for fiction within this market, while educational and study works have actually strengthened, and they represent 3/4 of the market in Russia. And much of the balance is taken up with children's literature. So it's a different market in many ways from the others that are described here. In India, there's a strong market for translated works, 22 official languages, 122 dialects spoken. Reality is that that's kind of the official line. In practice, there are many sub-dialects within that. So it's an opportunity to grow, but I think there has to be at least some commitment to translating it from English, French, or another language. As I noted in the introduction, there's growing internet access, some growth in digital consumption, but it still lags a lot of the other markets to which it's compared. And the final piece is that Flipkart was acquired by the U.S. retailer Walmart recently and is now being integrated. It's seen generally as a move on Walmart's part to expand into South Asia and to become a more aggressive competitor. The second group of 3 in the emerging markets bracket include Poland, which has been shrinking since 2010, and that includes both title output and number of retail outlets. It's a relatively weaker reading market. Only 40+% of Poles have read a book in the last year. But translations account for 20% of the title output, which is encouraging, particularly for Canadian publishers looking to export. Ebook sales are akin to what they are in Germany, half what they are in the UK, and maybe a third or less of what they are in the US. And online sales seem to be about a third. Slovenia has a single price for books act that tends to protect bookstores, and is characteristic of other markets in the EU. It does maintain a database of translated Slovenian authors, which can be useful if you're looking to bring books into Canada. They have made several campaigns to promote reading, but and those seem to be successful, particularly given the strength of the market in a relatively small, it's a 2 million population, relatively small country. And ebook sales itself have been actually pretty much flattened at just under $1 million, so less than 1% of the total market. And if you're familiar with the UAE, it's book fairs. There's multiple initiatives there to promote literacy, highly dependent on imports. There's not a big title production market in the UAE. But as if you're familiar with it, you know, domestic and imported titles are subject to approval. It's relatively, I wouldn't say tightly controlled, but it's not an open market in the sense that any deal can be made. We broke out the third category into other markets that are featuring English, that might be open to English language titles. This is a somewhat more comparable title. One of the surprises is the relatively low percentage of internet users in Italy. But you also see a strong book market in the Netherlands. It's a small market overall, 17 million population, but one of the few countries in which per capita sales each year are over $100. Some more detail on those set of countries. Australia itself peaked in title output in 2013 and has been down about a quarter since then. Ebook share is actually relatively high, and there was some effort to reduce import restrictions, but meaning that books imported to Australia, but those have stalled, and it's still a relatively protected market. Significant political issue in the Australian market. Italy, and we'll talk about this again among French language publisher for French language markets, has seen several down years, but in 2017 rebounded fairly strongly. So far this year, it appears to be flat to down. Ebook share is not that significant. It's about 3%. A robust market for translation, it's said to represent as much as a fifth of the total market for books published, and something close to something north of 60% of all books that have been translated were originally written in English. So it's a stronger market with respect to, if you're going to publish it as an Italian translation, starting out as English is probably a better footing. Japan offers a fixed price market, meaning that the price of books cannot be discounted except with relatively severe restrictions, and that protects bookstores. So you see a significant market for bricks and mortar. They do allow returns, but it's a relatively small market for translated works right now, something in the range of less than 10%. Among the other countries, the Netherlands, which, as you recall, has a very strong per capita spending profile, has seen steady growth since about 2014. But it's primarily in physical formats. Digital sales represent about 5% of the total. And Kobo Plus, it's said that the Netherlands actually has a particularly severe piracy problem. And Kobo Plus, the subscription service, which launched in 2017, was widely constructed as an anti-piracy initiative to try and give people easier and consistent access and to get at least some revenue rather than lose it to counterfeit or pirated content. South Korea has kind of flipped. There's been a decline in physical sales over the last 5 years and strong recent growth in digital. Also, in the same way, a 37% jump in online sales. But online is actually less than 5% of the total market. And about a quarter of all works sold in Korea are actually translations. So you're a potentially strong market for books that are popular in Canada, or for that matter, really specific to a topic of interest in the South Korean market. Spain itself has a fixed book price and digital share around 8%. There are a number of entities are actually working to offer shared access to metadata and real-time market data. This is a particularly encouraging development because, as I said earlier, with respect to Brazil, the presence of metadata is fundamentally a core component of effective marketing, particularly in online environments. 3 countries, repeating Italy, that are of interest to the French-speaking market. Among them, Austria, quite small by comparison, but a very high per capita book sales, in that small category that are over $100 Canadian. And France and Italy themselves are comparable in overall market size, and with France getting the edge on the overall size of the economy. Some trends that are probably well known to French language publishers in the Canadian market. Austria and France are known for fixed book price. Austria itself has modest growth, about a 1% a year in the book market, and limited ebook uptake. That it's somewhere falling between 5 and 7%. Rakuten Overdrive, which is the library supplier came into the market in 2016. It also went into Germany and Switzerland. So those are, if you're selling books or trying to sell books in the library market, Overdrive is an option for you there. In France, fixed book prices I mentioned a moment ago, but a decline in sales, both in revenue and in units in 2017. That's thought to be tied in part to a change in the national curriculum. Digital, a little bit higher than Austria, but still half of what it might be in the United States and below what you would see in the UK. Foreign rights have actually been a relatively robust part of the market, 211 million, but it's spread across 15,000 deals. So the transactions themselves are not necessarily that big. But the number of deals is up 9% in 2017 over 2016. So an indication of a growing or potentially robust rights market. In Italy, I've covered a moment before, but it's been strong growth in the most recent times, but it had been several down years before that. The last two markets that we have are Denmark and Sweden. These are relatively small markets. You can see population between 5 and 10 million. High degree of internet population, and relatively high in the case of Denmark per capita book sales, relatively low in the case of Sweden. Two things that we wanted or two profiles for these two countries. The number of titles in Denmark has actually increased really significantly. Printed releases are up almost 60% in the last 10 years, but the time given to reading has actually declined by reports and surveys of the population. Very small ebook market at the moment, and some audiobook lending. And there's thought to be as many as 240,000 different titles available through various Danish libraries. In Sweden, relatively modest growth, not a lot of movement in it. Digital sales are up significantly, but the ebook market ebook share is still considered to be somewhere between 1% and 2%. So there's been a big movement lately, but it's largely driven by audiobooks. And then sales seem to be shifting from bookstores to online, but it still heavily favors bookstores within it. It's just the most recent shifts have been against bookstores. So part of this project was to look at ebook pricing in various markets, or actually various areas. And so let's spend a little bit of time on that. The three regions that we looked at were North America, the UK, and Western Europe and France. In North America, and to be fair, this is really the U.S., our primary focus was export, not the Canadian market itself. So the U.S. market is not fixed price. There's competition throughout it. Major publishers, as indicated at the overview, moved fairly heavily to agency pricing in 2011. Essentially, they set the price for a given book, and they take a share, generally considered to be 30%, of the sale in exchange for the agent working on behalf of the publisher. That effectively put up the price of the average ebook from what might have been $9.90, generally thought $7 to $10, to something closer to $12.99, $13, or $15. At that point, some of the demand for ebooks abated. But outside of the largest publishers, there's actually a thought that there's heavy discounting. The self-published market, independently published market, could well be at $2 to $5. Some of the data that you'll see in the final report. There's a sweet spot for pricing that's somewhere below $7, which is helpful in promoting books. The other thing to take away, and there's enough debate about this to just put an asterisk toward it, significant parts of the marketplace may not be measured. So the independently published ebooks that are sold, for example, primarily on Amazon or through Ingram Spark or another platform like Smashwords, may not be measured through traditional channels. You may not see them in NPD, Nielsen, formerly Nielsen, BookScan data. And so we're not absolutely sure how big the market is. And that may also play a role in trying to figure out whether and how ebook sales are changing, at least in the U.S. market. Now in the UK, like North America, it's not a fixed price market, and it's also a market where major publishers move to agency pricing. But outside of the largest publishers, there's really heavy discounting. The sources on this are, most ebooks sold somewhere below £2 UK, so for argument's sake, $3, with volume that sold below £1, that 2.5 times as many units were sold below £1 as were sold between £1 and £2. So it appears, based on that data, to be highly price sensitive. The other thing that's interesting is that almost no ebooks sold above £7. The data seems pretty clear in that regard that there's just not a robust market for higher priced ebooks in the UK. And I think that building on what I said with respect to independent sales in the US, there may be some measurement challenges in the UK. They're not generally seen to be as severe as is the case with the US titles, and what you see and what you see reported about the UK market is probably more accurate than what we currently have available in the US. And then when it comes to Western Europe and France, predominantly fixed price markets, publishers can and do charge less for ebooks on occasion, but in a number of cases, there's been differential VAT, value-added tax, that complicated pricing. So books were effectively given a more favorable VAT, physical books, or given a more favorable VAT and have been for quite some time. Ebooks were not considered books in the classical sense, and so they were not given the ability for pricing at the VATs that individual countries might have chosen for physical books. In effect, that raised prices. But just recently, now 2 months ago, the EU voted to let its members choose a different VAT rate for ebooks. And that's a significant difference. It's going to play out over time because each country has to then decide what it wants to do with respect to the value-added tax for ebooks. But in most fixed-price markets, ebook prices are discounted about, or at least as much as the difference between the physical and the digital or ebook value-added tax rate. So you're seeing something like the VAT difference plus about 20% less. That gets close to parity, but it doesn't really get the price well below, similar to what you might see in the U.S. and certainly not in the UK. For translations, although those are really significant considerations. We've included some of the data here, more including particularly things like the literacy population, literate population and the like, will be included in the full report. But the World Factbook, and in many cases national sites, whether it's for the Publishing Association or just advocacy like the UAE, has made it a significant initiative in their country. Those are resources that can be really good to help fill in. We didn't repeat all the information from the World Factbook we extracted, but if you go to the World Factbook free resource in the U.S., you can get a tremendous amount of background in individual countries that is not necessarily publishing specific, but it's good to know and often can help both inform your negotiations and maybe ward off negotiations when there's instability that concerns you. The other thing that I would suggest within that is to check for gaps. For example, where literacy is high but per capita sales are low, or perhaps a smaller market but growing population. These are signs of both, they could be warning signs, but they're also potentially flags for opportunity. And we tried to include some of that both today and in the upcoming report. One thing I would add is you really want to think about moving early on ebook availability, especially if you're working with international distributors already. There's a increasing demand for digital content, even if the ebook market itself is not necessarily robust. The reality is if you don't make the book available in a market and somebody wants it, it's either a lost sale or potentially an incentive for piracy. And one of the things that we really tried to draw, particularly with Digital Exports Revisited, the 2017 update that I did with Ebook Canada Books, is to say that there's an opportunity to do quite a bit with international markets on a more timely basis than has been the case in the past, with either negotiated sales or right sales or sending translated works into a market. There's increasing, it's hopefully axiomatic at this point, but you really need to express prices in local currency. This is possible using metadata, and particularly if you're already on Onyx 3. And you'll hear this from every international retailer and all of your trading partners. And you have to match the basic range of local prices. If you try to protect your price, particularly for a digital product, in a given market, and it's way out of line with what the local market will bear, you're not going to move any units. And the last piece is, this is a relatively new development, but you want to keep up to date with whatever's happening in individual countries with respect to VAT rates relative to print and overall price. We can point to that in this report, and we'll include as much up-to-date information as is possible in the final version, but the reality is that it will continue to change as we go forward, even beyond what we include in this report. The next steps actually are we're developing this data set into a full report that, as Gabrielle said, will be available in 2019. It will include information that didn't fit here. The final report will also include a robust index and a detailed description and methodology The index will have a number of different resources that we've used, and you can consult as primary sources. And if you have a suggestion coming out of this webinar, if you contact Gabrielle this month, it'll help us shape the final report. At this point, I think we're prepared to turn to questions. Lenore Balhaka has asked if I could explain what a VAT is. It's essentially a sales tax. It's applied in a way that's somewhat different but it's included in the price of whatever product is sold. And unlike, for example, in the United States, sales tax would typically be administered at a state level or a provincial level in Canada, and it would be a specific set percentage. So it would be added onto a sale. So the price would be expressed as $10, and if your tax was 5%, you would be charged $10.50. The VAT is included in the price, and it's differential depending on the type of product. So physical books and digital books to this point have had different tax rates, and in effect, it has pushed up the price of digital books. Other questions that we received ahead of time that I just want to spend a little bit of time on. They asked for a better understanding of ebook pricing strategies. We were also asked about how pricing strategies vary across territory and distribution of sales platform. Some of that we've already covered, but we'll have a couple of other thoughts. We had a request for additional information on the German market, a request on how other countries deal with scholarly and academic books, and copyright issues for ebooks adopted as textbooks. And I think we also had a question that I hadn't added here with respect to any trends that we might be able to talk about in the North American school library market. So why don't we'll go through each of these and then come back. Ebook pricing strategies. First, I'd say that this is covered pretty well in the 2017 Ebook Canada publication, Digital Exports Revisited. And one of the things that comes out is that low marginal cost, meaning that it doesn't cost a lot to create an additional ebook. The general strategy there is revenue maximization for e-only titles. So if you're publishing a book only as an ebook, even if it's only as an ebook in a given market, then going to a lower price might actually maximize your revenue. So if you sell, as was the example in the UK, 2.5 times as many books with a price below £1 than a price of £2, then you're actually going to make more money dropping your price. But you can only get there by testing. The second piece of that is books with print counterparts. So if you're releasing a hardcover or a paperback version of a book in a given market, then it gets trickier because the market seems to want half off a hardcover price as an ebook price, and publishers in markets like the U.S. are pushing softcover equivalent instead. So there's a gap there. It might be somewhere in the range of $7 is a desired price, $7 US in this case, versus a $12 or $13 sale for closer to the softcover. That's tough to pull off. And the problem there, particularly in international markets, is the greater the difference between price and expectation, the greater the risk of piracy. So, and I'd go back to the thing I said a few minutes ago with respect to pricing. You have to match local prices to the best of your ability, and you have to be expressing those prices in local currencies. And it complicates things from a publishing perspective, but that's what the retailing context that we've had said drives sales. Then there's a question about territorial and platform impact on pricing strategy. I think that I'd make a strong pitch for availability, meaning that making the books available as widely as possible. It can help with price, and it can also reduce piracy. I mean, if you're not there, people are going to find, and then people want to read a book, they're going to find a way to get the book, or they're going to move on and read a different book, and that's a lost sale as well. Local prices and currencies, again, if you have the opportunity to go ebook first, you can test lower prices to maximize revenue. I think the VAT differentials, the sales tax differentials will be around for a while, and you have to keep them in mind when setting your prices. So if you want an ebook price of €5 in a particular market, if the VAT is 20%, you have to take that out before to reach that $5 price or €5 price. The other thing I'd say that it's really critically important is make your rights metadata right. It's an area where Onyx 3 as a metadata standard is a better option, but sometimes it's even the simplest things, like the old expressions might have been rest of world. That doesn't really work for digital content. It's a market by market play, and you have to be able to track those things really carefully. If you don't, then you're potentially going to go to a retailing platform that says, well, I don't have an explicit rights to sell it in this market, so I'm not going to feature it. Or they might override things that would put the book for sale in markets where you don't have the rights. And generally, retailing platforms work really hard to try and respect agreements, so their default is to do no harm. And if that results in the book not being made available, then that's not good for a publisher. With respect to the German market and additional information, part of me wanted to say, I've given you a lot of information, but there is actually some good information that might be helpful today. So the average buyer actually bought 12.4 books in 2017, up from 11 in 2016. There were fewer book buyers overall. It's been down about 12% in the last 12 years. Now, that's a significant decline. So the average book buyer is buying more, but there are fewer overall, so the market is relatively stagnant. The country focus fundamentally is on things like marketing solutions, customer outreach, and new formats. Ebooks themselves, though, are down as a percentage of the total market. Rights sales from Germany, meaning that German books sold elsewhere, were dominated by children's titles. I mean, you can see that almost 40%. And then the strongest growth in rights sales from Germany, again, German books sold elsewhere, favored travel, nonfiction, and education. And interestingly, the leading purchaser, something like 40% of the purchases of German rights came from China. So a strong market in China for German and German language content. With respect to scholarly books and related copyright issues, there are macro differences between the U.S. and Europe. Open access plans at this point are predominantly EU-driven. Plan S is an example of it as a governmental initiative. There's a growing open access movement in the U.S., but the U.S. government has virtually no role in it. In fact, one of the things that was BISG is part of an overall effort to establish measures, what we call open access ebook analytics. So how to best measure usage of open access books to better establish value. We had a summit on that topic about a week and a half ago here in New York. And one of the things that was really clear was the difference. The participants included folks from Europe as well as from the United States. And there are significant differences in the university press perspective here versus various publishers, including university and scholarly and academic publishers in Europe, which is much more robust. Canada has had, as you know, sweeping changes in copyright for educational materials. They're under review. But that's significantly changed how copyright plays out in the Canadian market. Within the EU, books that are adopted by some government-sponsored entity may lose copyright protection. I mean, that's a little bit unclear. I mean, that's tied to Plan S in a regard. It's just already the case in the U.S. that research funded by the U.S. government, at least some version of it, is required to be open access and cannot be copyrighted. But there are exceptions to that as well. And if you're familiar, there are at least a couple of influential rulings in the United States. One is referred to generally as Kurtzang, and Kurtzang was essentially a reimportation argument. Somebody who bought books, physical books, in the Indian market and then brought them back and sold them for a profit at a much lower price in the United States. Wiley brought the suit and lost it, and the precedent at this point is that that's a legitimate reimportation activity. The natural outgrowth of that is really changing the way that publishers like Wiley, who market physical books overseas, what they offer and how they price it. And Georgia State is an ongoing case within the United States, still unresolved. I think it might go to the Supreme Court next on the use of educational materials. The last thing I just wanted to touch upon was the open-ended question about trends in the school library market and what we might see. As I mentioned at the outset, we focused on export markets, so we didn't look at the Canadian markets. In North America, I can't say specifically, but we took some time to talk to colleagues, particularly at Baker & Taylor, which serves the school library market. And then there was if you're familiar with it, there was a dip that really kicked in most severely between 2010 and 2014. After the 2008 crash, state revenues collapsed significantly, so the planning periods for those budgets had already been done. But as revenues declined, so too did support for educational materials and libraries. It's recovered somewhat since then, but it's generally not described as robust. So from 15 to 18, some growth in specific areas. But there's also a mindfulness that they're supporting the curriculum and serving, for example, classroom sets of books, et cetera, takes greater priority and precedence than does restocking a library. So they continue to be under some challenge in the U.S. market. The other thing that plays a role, though it wasn't generally cited as strongly, is that the average price of ebooks sold to library markets has either gone up, or if it's maintained, its usage has been limited. So that a book has to be replaced after, say, 26 loans, or some other number that the terms vary by publisher. And that's made some libraries a little bit risk averse with respect to licensing or buying digital content. Those are the questions we had up in advance. Gabriella, I'll stop here and see what else we have that we might be helpful on.
Yes, there's a question now in the Q&A section about asking if there are any thoughts on scholarly professional book pricing in the retail market.
It's not an area in which I'm strong, but I think in general you can price higher. The difficulty is mapping to what aspects of retail you want to reach. If you're trying to reach an academic audience, pricing that could be sometimes above $75 to as much as $150 is not that unusual, particularly for smaller works. But you also compete with open access titles that are fundamentally free and available in a digital format, sometimes for that market. The other thing that plays a role is that Amazon has entered more significantly into this market. It hadn't really done a lot of work on selling academic titles until perhaps 5 years ago. And as has been the case with most online sales, not just specific to Amazon, is that the more widespread the sales are online, the greater the price transparency and the greater the pressure on total price. So you either give up, you might maintain margin with the retailer and take a lower price, or you may find that both you and the retailer are struggling a bit to have to give up both price and margin, because there are both online competition as well as potentially used books depending on the use. If that doesn't quite get at the question, please do come back.
And there's also now a separate question on the terms of children's ebook sales. Is that something that you have come across in your research, Brian?
Yeah, I can't say that I know a lot about terms, and it's part of it is we were looking at a country level rather than a trading partner level. That's not Ebook Canada Books and Book Industry Study Group alike. You need to be mindful that you can't ask questions that are directly related to pricing without violating part of our charter. But I think that in general, I think you're seeing at a country level very strong growth in demand for children's books. I've heard anecdotally that China is actively purchasing access to content in the UAE as well. Sometimes it's not just children's, but also educational. So when there's demand, generally the margins in terms probably are less of an issue. And there's been robust growth in several markets that we've covered here today, and in the final report in children's publishing. So it's probably, I would speculate that it's probably less of an issue there than it is in smaller, slower moving markets.
Yeah, I just wanted to add a note to that. We published a report on the Indian market last year. So for those of you who haven't seen it, I recommend going to our website and downloading a copy. And the consultant who wrote that market for us did quite a substantive section on the children's market in that country, and it's really growing, as also in terms of sort of the scholarly market there, because there's a growing middle class. So even if the overall market might not be as robust as the other emerging markets, those sectors in particular are finding way more interest. Here we go. So there's now one from Marie-Ève. It says, I think it's asking for more information about the school libraries, and was wondering if there is a pricing model for ebooks used in a class in different countries.
I can give a reasonably comprehensive answer for the U.S. market. We did not study it for other markets, and certainly I'll try to come back and, as we write the final report, layer this in. There are multiple pricing models, whether it's for sets, for use, and for digital content in the library market, school library market, and Drive and Bibliothèque are both really aggressive in this regard, but it's fundamentally driven by what publishers choose to do. They have the various retail or distribution platforms have the ability to support multiple models, and they will continue to evolve those. But there are probably if there's anything, a complaint within the library community, at least in the United States, is that the publishers have many different models and they'd like to simplify them, or at least make them more standard. It's something that BISG is actually involved with a division of the American Library Association in the U.S. market to do a study project specifically to try and come up with more coherent descriptions of library terms. It's publisher-driven more than anything else.
So there's another question here. It's from Tom. Could you please elaborate on how publishers can protect themselves from the reimportation of foreign editions? So that goes on to say, we have a problem with one of our titles where the much cheaper Indian edition is directly competing with our own edition on Amazon.
It's an important question, and I'm assuming that what we're talking about here is a physical rather than a digital product. So part of this study is fundamentally about the global ebook market. We look at the size of the overall book market, but then identify trends and best practices with respect to digital content. But the reimportation of physical content is something that we've been thinking about a lot at BISG. The Kurtzlang ruling, which I referred to just a few minutes ago, is specifically about the reimportation of content from India in the U.S. market, and it is problematic. What publishers in the U.S. at least have done in response to the Kurtzlang ruling is change what they offer in various markets. Generally, you can't just jack the price up. If you did, you wouldn't have any sales in that market. But that is one defensive maneuver, is to say, look, we'll make the content available, but you have to pay fundamentally what you would pay in the U.S. market. The second is to change the offering, so essentially to substantially alter the book so that it's not comparable to what you might be using in the U.S. market or the Canadian market, if that's where it's being reimported. So that it's customized, it's smaller, or perhaps the third option is to add a component that makes it critical to, for example, have online access as a part of the overall value proposition for the physical product. Those are kind of defensive maneuvers in that regard. There's also been growing use of counterfeit technology and sourcing technology. Companies like LSC Communications here in the U.S., LSC is actually more broad than the U.S., but LSC has been offering ways to track individual books and to validate them in specific ways. Separately, and I don't mean to point you to a BISG resource on a Leave a Canada Books webinar, but we have, and I'm happy to share it. We've done a couple of webinars on what we call gray market and third-party sales. The most recent one that would be useful, or the one that would probably be most useful, I think we did last December. If you go to the BISG website, bisg.org, and look at Watch Past Webinars, which is a drop-down from the events menu. That might be a useful hour for you to spend. Don't go now. Wait until I'm done. But it's the thing that I'd suggest is that there are different ways to combat that, and that webinar actually tackles the strategies in a variety of different ways, and it's layered in with some data as well.
Great, thank you. There's one more question here, at least one more question, and it is, are there significant differences in the ways libraries and library wholesalers in these countries buy books?
Yeah, absolutely, and I think that one of the things that isn't done as well in this report, maybe we can refine it between now and its final version, is essentially a map of how each country operates. Supply chain maps and sales maps and how these things work vary very much from country to country, and it's one of the things that we more accurately. This is kind of a market overview, as I explained a moment ago. But in Digital Exports Revisited, one of the things that we had a chance to talk about is the difference of working with a local partner, doing something directly, and if you do something directly, how do you need to operate? And those differences, country by country, are sometimes difficult to navigate if you don't have a trusted partner on the ground in those markets. So, there are a lot of differences, and it wasn't the purview of this particular report, but it is covered in Digital Exports from 2017.
I think that's all. I hope I've caught them all now. That seems to be all.
Go ahead. I mean, if you want to take a minute, I'm happy to wait, because sometimes people are shy or need a moment to put together their question.
Absolutely. And I wanted to point out, I think, in terms of the questions around the school library market. In the U.S., we have just published a market guide on selling to mass merchandisers and non-traditional accounts in the U.S., and there is a section especially on the school library market, who our consultant had worked with Follett, I think that's how you pronounce it, for quite a long time, so has quite a bit of experience with that market. So if you wanted to look at that, it's the latest guide. We just published it, I believe it was in October. And again, I've said this a few times already, but I really do, for more specific questions, we do have a lot of resources on our website, of course also on the BISG Book Industry Study Group website. That would be really helpful for those more sort of specific questions that we can't answer today or in the scope of, sort of a market overview.
Good. That's a really important point. I found the resources that the first question I ask whenever I start a project with Libra Canada Books is, what else have you been working on? Because the answer is almost always something that's relevant. So I'd also add that it's an evolving marketplace, and essentially this is a good start to a conversation, but there will always be more answers out there. I think we have a couple more slides. Let me just put them up. The first is contact information for the two of us, which is really important. And I'd welcome any inquiries. I'd encourage, if you do ask me something, to copy Gabrielle, because she's ultimately responsible for holding me to task, and you want her to know about it. And obviously the resources that Gabrielle was referring to a moment ago. Really important. And these links will be made available to you with the presentation as part of this overall webinar. I want to say thank you and encourage you, as Gabrielle did at the outset, to fill out an evaluation. I think you'll both have an opportunity to do so directly as well and get an email from us.
Yes, we'll send out. There'll be at the end of the webinar, they'll have directed to a link for filling out the evaluation, and of course you can do it directly through here. Once you receive the PDF of the presentation, you'll also be able to follow the link directly. So it looks like the questions are done, and I think this is probably a good place to end for today. Thanks so much, Brian, for the presentation, for this information. It's been very useful. It's good to be thinking about what, the next steps for the report that's coming out and the kinds of markets we'll be looking at. I'd like to thank all of the participants who attended today. Thank you so much for your time and for your great questions. Those were really useful to us and will, again, give us a lot to think about in the next couple of months. And, of course, I would like to thank Canadian Heritage for their support, who help make these webinars possible. And if you have any additional comments or questions, as Brian said, please feel free to contact us directly. You have our contact information. We're happy to answer any questions that we can. Thanks again to everyone, and hope you have a great rest of your day.
Okay. Thank you, Gabrielle, and thank you, everybody, for being part of today's conversation.